A desperate plea echoed through the desolate ranch. "Can you take me instead?" The lonely rancher's decision would forever alter the course of two sisters' lives, setting in motion events no one could have predicted. Little did they know that the isolation of the countryside concealed both dangers and unexpected bonds that would test the very limits of family loyalty. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on John Smith's weathered hat as he stood at the edge of his property, squinting against the glare. Sweat trickled down his temple, leaving trails through the dust caked on his sun-bronzed face. At 42, the rancher had grown accustomed to the harsh rhythms of the territory, the blistering days, the bone-chilling nights, and the constant vigilance required to keep both predators and rivals at bay. His calloused hands rested on the worn fence post as he surveyed his cattle grazing in the distance. The herd was smaller than he'd hoped for this season, but they were healthy despite the unforgiving climate. This land had been his only companion for nearly 7 years now, its vast emptiness both a comfort and a curse. The distant rumble of wheels caught his attention. John turned toward the sound, watching as a cloud of dust rose from the trail leading to Red Rock. The stagecoach appeared more battered than usual, its wooden frame creaking audibly even from a distance as it bounced along the rutted path. He rarely paid much attention to new arrivals. Most were just passing through, seeking fortunes further west. But something made him linger, watching as the vehicle lurched to a stop in front of the general store. The door swung open and two women emerged, a stark contrast to the usual rough-hewn miners and opportunists who typically disembarked. Mary Johnson stepped down first, her posture rigid, despite obvious exhaustion. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, practical and unadorned. She scanned the dusty main street with wary eyes that had clearly seen hardship. Behind her came Sarah Johnson, younger and softer, her face still holding traces of wonder, despite whatever trials had brought them to this unforgiving corner of the territory. The older sister gripped a worn carpet bag in one hand, the other protectively guiding Sarah onto the street. Their dresses, though clean, showed signs of mending and long wear. They stood close together, two figures against the vast landscape, somehow both vulnerable and resolute. Something stirred in John's chest, an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. It had been years since he'd felt anything beyond the dull determination needed to survive each day. Yet watching these women step into the harsh reality of Red Rock awakened something long dormant. The stoic rancher turned away, uncomfortable with his own reaction. He had cattle to tend and fences to mend, no time for curiosity about strangers. Still, as he mounted his horse and rode back toward his isolated homestead, he couldn't shake the feeling that the arrival of these sisters would somehow alter the carefully constructed solitude he'd built around himself. Mary Johnson moved through the dusty streets of Red Rock with the wariness of a hunted animal. Her eyes, sharp as flint, missed nothing as she guided her younger sister through the chaotic new world they'd been thrust into. The sisters were as different as summer and winter. Mary had been forged in hardship, while Sarah still carried the light of innocence despite everything they'd lost. "Do you think we'll ever have a home again?" Sarah asked one evening, her voice small as they unpacked their meager belongings in the cramped room above the general store. Mary paused, weathered hands smoothing a faded dress. "We have each other. That's home enough." But her words rang hollow, even to her own ears. Their family farm in Missouri, once vibrant with wheat fields and laughter, was nothing but memory now. The railroad company had taken everything, their father's resistance crumbling beneath legal papers and threats. Mary still remembered the flames consuming their barn. Whether by accident or design, she would never know. Their parents hadn't survived the winter that followed. Red Rock was supposed to be their fresh start, but Mary quickly realized the Arizona territory offered its own brand of danger. The sisters earned their keep, helping the storekeeper, but their room's thin floorboards did little to muffle the sounds from the saloon below. Drunken shouts, bawdy laughter, and the tinny notes of a poorly tuned piano filtered upward each night. "It's not so bad," Sarah insisted, ever the optimist. "Mr. Jenkins pays fair, and I've already made a friend with the baker's daughter." Mary didn't respond. She'd seen how the men watched her sister, too young to understand the hunger in their eyes. Their third night in town, a fight erupted in the saloon. The sound of shattering glass and men's roars sent Sarah scrambling into Mary's arms. A gunshot cracked the night air, followed by terrible silence, then renewed shouting. "We can't stay here," Mary whispered, holding her trembling sister. By morning, bloodstains marked the wooden sidewalk below their window. Mary's determination hardened as she watched Sarah's hopeful spirit begin to dim in this rough-edged town. They needed stability, safety. The storekeeper's wages wouldn't build them a future or protect them from the territory's dangers. As Mary stood in the doorway of the general store, watching dust devils dance across the street, her gaze caught on a solitary figure loading supplies into a wagon. John Smith, the rancher who rarely spoke but whose reputation for fairness had reached even her cautious ears. Something stirred in Mary's mind, a possibility. Perhaps what they needed wasn't a place, but a person. Someone solid as the earth itself, with land and walls between them and the chaos of red rock. She straightened her shoulders, decision made. They would need an anchor in this wilderness, and Mary would find it, whatever the cost. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as John Smith guided his horse along the dusty trail leading back to his ranch. The distant silhouette of a stranded wagon caught his eye, and as he approached, he recognized the two sisters who had recently arrived in Red Rock. Mary Johnson stood with hands on hips, frustration evident in her rigid posture, while Sarah Johnson crouched beside their broken wagon wheel, poking at the splintered wood with curious fingers. John dismounted without a word, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as he approached. Mary straightened immediately, her hand instinctively moving to shield her younger sister. "We don't need charity," Mary stated firmly, though the broken wheel told a different story. John simply nodded, kneeling beside the damaged wheel. His weathered hands, marked by years of ranch work, moved with practiced precision as he examined the splintered spokes. "Got tools in my saddlebag," he finally said, words as sparse as rainfall in the territory. While he worked, Sarah edged closer, fascination overcoming her initial shyness. "Have you always lived out here, Mr. Smith?" she asked, her voice carrying the lilt of someone who still found wonder in the harsh landscape. The rancher continued working, hammering a spoke back into place before answering. "Long enough." Mary remained standing, arms crossed, watching his every move with cautious eyes. The sisters had learned the hard way that kindness often came with hidden costs, especially for two women alone in the West. "We can pay you," she offered stiffly. John shook his head, focusing on aligning the wheel. "No need." As he worked, Sarah peppered him with questions about his ranch and the surrounding territory. Each of her inquiries received minimal responses, yet the younger sister seemed undeterred by his reticence. When the wheel was finally secured, John stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. The repair wasn't perfect, but it would hold until they reached town. "Thank you," Sarah said warmly, offering a genuine smile that seemed out of place in the harsh landscape. Mary nodded her agreement, her gratitude reluctant but sincere. "We appreciate the help." Something in their voices, perhaps the blend of Sarah's openness and Mary's fierce protectiveness, stirred an emotion John had long suppressed. For a fleeting moment, the loneliness of his existence pressed against him with tangible weight. The connection, however fragile, reminded him of what his life lacked. He mounted his horse without ceremony, tipping his hat slightly. "Safe travels," he offered, then turned away, before they could see the longing in his eyes, the quiet ache for family, for voices in his empty home, for something beyond cattle and dust and endless sky. As John rode away, the familiar weight of solitude settled back onto his shoulders, heavier somehow than before this chance encounter on the trail. Mary Johnson woke to the sound of breaking glass and drunken shouts from the saloon below their rented room. Beside her, Sarah stirred restlessly, dark circles under her eyes testifying to another night of interrupted sleep. This was the third such disturbance this week, and Mary had reached her limit. "We can't stay here," she whispered, stroking her sister's hair. "This isn't safe for either of us." The next morning, Mary stood at the window, watching John Smith ride into town for supplies. His weathered face remained impassive as he tied his horse outside the general store. She had noticed how he worked his land alone, how his eyes carried a weight similar to her own. An idea formed, dangerous perhaps, but necessary. When John emerged from the store, Mary approached him directly. "Mr. Smith, I have a proposition for you." He regarded her cautiously, hat tipped against the Arizona sun. "Sarah and I need somewhere safe to stay," Mary continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "We're willing to work, hard work, in exchange for shelter on your ranch." John's expression hardened. "I work alone, Miss Johnson." "You have too much land for one man," she countered. "I can mend fences, cook, clean. Sarah's young, but she learns quickly." Mary gestured toward her sister, who stood nervously nearby. "We just need a chance." John shifted uncomfortably, memories flashing across his face. The last time he trusted strangers on his property, they'd stolen from him, left him more isolated than before. Yet something in Mary's determined stance gave him pause. "It's not easy work," he warned. "Days start before dawn, end after dusk." "We're not afraid of work," Mary replied. "We're afraid of having nowhere safe to sleep." John glanced toward Sarah, noting her hopeful expression despite her obvious exhaustion. The girl reminded him of someone he'd once known, someone he'd failed to protect. "1 month," he finally said. "We'll try it for 1 month." Relief washed over Mary's face, though she quickly masked it with practicality. "We'll be ready to leave within the hour." As they loaded their meager belongings onto John's wagon, Sarah whispered, "Do you think this is a good idea?" Mary watched the rancher securing their trunks, his movements efficient and careful. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it's better than what we have now." What none of them realized as the wagon pulled away from Red Rock was how this arrangement would change them all. John, driving the horses with steady hands, had no idea he'd just invited both his salvation and his greatest challenge onto his land. Mary, sitting straight-backed beside him, couldn't foresee how this decision would unravel her carefully constructed defenses. And Sarah, watching the town shrink behind them, never imagined this journey would transform her from a girl into a woman of the West. Life on the ranch was unrelenting. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Mary Johnson proved herself stronger than John Smith had anticipated. Her hands, once soft from her previous life, quickly developed calluses as she mended broken fence lines and wrangled stubborn cattle alongside the stoic rancher. She never complained, even when her muscles screamed in protest after long days of labor. "You work harder than most men I've hired," John remarked one evening as they returned from checking the northern boundary of his property. Mary merely shrugged. "We do what we must to survive." Meanwhile, Sarah Johnson brought an unexpected warmth to the lonely homestead. Her laughter, bright and genuine, floated across the dusty yard as she fed the chickens or helped prepare meals. The younger sister seemed to find joy in the simplest things: a wildflower growing between rocks, a newborn calf taking its first wobbly steps, the colors of sunset painting the vast Arizona sky. John found himself drawn to Sarah's infectious enthusiasm. One crisp morning, he offered to teach her to ride properly. "Not just sitting sideways on that old mare," he explained, adjusting the saddle on a gentle chestnut horse. Real riding, the kind that might save your life out here. Sarah's eyes lit up with excitement. Will you teach me to use a lasso too? The rancher couldn't help but smile at her eagerness. One step at a time, Miss Sarah. Day by day, Sarah's confidence grew. She learned to guide her mount with subtle shifts of weight, to read the animal's moods, and eventually to throw a rope with surprising accuracy. Her delight was infectious, bringing rare smiles to John's weathered face. Mary watched these lessons from a distance, conflicting emotions churning inside her. Pride in her sister's accomplishments warred with growing concern. Each time Sarah galloped across the open field, whooping with joy, Mary felt a knot tighten in her chest. "You're teaching her to love this place," she said to John one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Sarah brush down her horse. "Is that so terrible?" he asked. Mary's gaze remained fixed on her sister. "This land takes more than it gives. The frontier has a way of stripping away innocence." John studied her profile in the fading light. "Like it did with you?" She didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. Mary feared that the same hardships that had hardened her own heart would eventually extinguish the light in Sarah's eyes. The younger Johnson sisters still believed in dreams and possibilities, while Mary had learned to expect only struggle and disappointment. Yet every sunrise brought its own challenges, and with them, small moments of unexpected grace that even Mary couldn't deny. The sky darkened without warning, a wall of dust rising from the horizon like a vengeful spirit. John Smith stood on his porch, watching as the massive cloud rolled toward his ranch, his weathered face tightening with concern. He'd seen storms like this before. They could scatter a herd for miles, killing the weaker animals and destroying weeks of work in mere hours. "We need to secure the cattle," he called to Mary Johnson, who was already pulling on her boots. Her sister Sarah appeared at her side, determination etched across her young features. "I'm coming too," Sarah insisted, ignoring Mary's protective glare. "We'll need every hand," John conceded, surprising himself. The rancher had never trusted outsiders with his livelihood before, yet here he was, accepting help from two women who'd arrived in Red Rock barely a month ago. They mounted in haste, the horses skittish beneath them, as the first gusts whipped dust into spiraling devils across the yard. Mary rode confidently, her months of practice evident in her straight back and firm grip. Sarah followed, less assured but no less determined, her blonde hair already coated in a fine layer of red earth. The wind howled like a wounded animal as they reached the grazing lands. John's cattle were already panicking, breaking formation and scattering toward the hills. He gestured wordlessly, and Mary understood, veering left to circle the frightened animals while he took the right flank. "Sarah, stay behind them!" he shouted over the roar of the storm. The younger Johnson sister nodded, pulling her bandana higher over her nose and mouth. For hours they worked, eyes burning, throats raw, as the dust storm raged around them. Visibility dropped to mere feet, but they persisted. John watched with growing admiration as Mary drove three strays back toward the main group, her slight frame somehow commanding against the elements. Sarah, despite her inexperience, showed remarkable instinct, anticipating the animals' movements and blocking their escape routes. When the last steer was finally corralled in the sheltered ravine, they slumped in their saddles, exhaustion claiming every muscle. The storm was beginning to abate, leaving them caked in dust but triumphant. "You both did well," John said simply, the words carrying more weight than their brevity suggested. Mary met his gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. They'd faced nature's fury together and prevailed. It was more than just saving cattle, it was proving their worth, their place on this land. Back at the ranch, as they unsaddled their exhausted mounts, John realized something had shifted. He trusted these women now, with his livelihood, with his daily struggles. The thought unsettled him. Trust meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had cost him dearly before. Yet watching the sisters move about his barn with newfound confidence, John couldn't help but wonder if some risks were worth taking after all. John Smith knew the bitter taste of betrayal all too well. The morning sun had barely crested the distant mountains when he discovered the fence lines cut along the western edge of his property. Severed wire coiled like angry snakes in the red dust. This wasn't random. It was calculated sabotage, designed to scatter his cattle across the territory. "Robert Brown," he muttered, his jaw clenched tight. The rival rancher had been eyeing his land for months, especially since rumors of the railroad's expansion had begun circulating through Red Rock. Land that had once seemed worthless was suddenly worth fighting or dying for. Mary Johnson found him kneeling by the damaged fence, his weathered hands attempting to twist the broken strands back together. She watched silently for a moment, taking in the rigid set of his shoulders. "We should set traps," she said finally, her voice cutting through the morning stillness. "Not to harm anyone, but to catch them in the act. Perhaps bells attached to thin wire, or—" John looked up, surprise evident in his eyes. "You've dealt with this before?" "Back home," Mary replied, kneeling beside him, "when the railroad men first came. They tried everything to drive us off before they finally succeeded." Her eyes darkened with memory. "We can also take shifts watching at night. Sarah and I can help." The rancher studied her face, seeing not just determination but a tactical mind he hadn't fully appreciated before. "I didn't take you for a strategist. Survival requires more than just strength," she said, helping him with the fence. "It requires outsmarting those who want what's yours." Back at the ranch house, Mary sketched a rough map of the property, marking vulnerable points. Sarah suggested using lanterns as signals if trouble arose. John watched them both, realizing that what had begun as a simple arrangement for shelter had evolved into something he hadn't dared hope for in years, a united front against the harshness of the territory. They were becoming a family, forged in the crucible of the Arizona wilderness. Mary Johnson found herself lingering in the doorway of the barn, watching John tend to a calf with a wounded leg. Her eyes traced the careful movements of his weathered hands as he wrapped a bandage around the small limb. The gentleness in his touch contradicted everything she'd first assumed about the stoic rancher. "Easy now," he murmured to the animal, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Mary stepped back, unseen, her heart beating strangely in her chest. These new feelings confused her. She respected his dedication to the land, admired his unwavering loyalty to his promises. But there was something more, growing beneath the surface, something that terrified her more than the harshest Arizona dust storm. The last time she'd allowed herself to care for someone beyond Sarah, she'd lost everything. Their family farm had been more than land. It had been security, identity, future. Now, standing on borrowed ground, with her sister's welfare hanging by a thread, Mary couldn't afford the luxury of attachment. Later that evening, as she kneaded dough for tomorrow's bread, her hands worked with mechanical precision while her mind wandered. John had ridden out to check the western fence line, leaving the sisters alone at the homestead. "He's not what I thought," Sarah said, appearing beside her with a stack of mended shirts. Mary glanced up. "What do you mean?" "I saw him with that injured calf today," her sister explained, setting down the folded laundry. "He spent an hour making sure it was comfortable. Never lost patience, not once." Mary nodded, trying to appear unmoved. "He's careful with his investments." Sarah laughed, the sound bright against the cabin's worn walls. "That's not it, and you know it. There's more to him than he shows most people." The younger Johnson sister had developed an uncanny ability to read the rancher. Where once she'd been intimidated by his gruff exterior, she now recognized the complexity beneath his silence. The man who had wordlessly fixed their wagon wheel that first day was the same one who now taught her to track deer prints and predict weather from cloud patterns. John returned after nightfall, bringing with him the scent of sage and open sky. Mary handed him a plate of food, careful to avoid his gaze when their fingers briefly touched. "Thank you," he said, the simple words carrying unexpected weight. That night, Mary lay awake, listening to the wind whistle through the cabin's eaves. She'd built walls around her heart to protect what little she had left. Yet somehow, this quiet man, with his steady hands and rare smiles, had found hairline cracks in her defenses. The thought both comforted and terrified her. Outside, the desert stars kept their ancient vigil over the ranch, indifferent to the complicated emotions taking root beneath them. The smell of smoke woke Mary Johnson first. She bolted upright in the small bedroom John had given her and Sarah, heart hammering against her ribs. Through the window, an orange glow painted the night sky with terror. "Fire!" she screamed, shaking her sister awake. "The barn's on fire!" They rushed outside to find John Smith already sprinting toward the inferno, his silhouette stark against the flames that devoured the wooden structure. The heat hit them like a physical blow as they approached, the crackle of burning timber drowning out even the panicked whinnies of the trapped horses. "The animals!" Sarah cried, her face illuminated by the hellish light. Without hesitation, the younger sister darted toward the barn's side entrance, ignoring Mary's desperate grab for her arm. John spotted her and bellowed, "Sarah, no!" But she had already disappeared into the smoke. Mary felt her world collapsing. First their family farm, now this ranch that had become their sanctuary. And worse, her beloved sister charging headlong into danger. She started forward, but John caught her, his grit firm. "I'll get her," he said, eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Get water from the well." Inside the barn, Sarah moved with surprising clarity. She'd spent weeks learning every corner of this place, and now that knowledge saved her life. Coughing through the thickening smoke, she threw open the stall doors, slapping the horses' flanks to drive them toward the exit. The frightened animals bolted past her, nearly trampling her in their panic. The cattle were harder, but Sarah persisted, her lungs burning as she guided them through the haze. When John found her, she was leading the last calf toward safety, her dress singed and her face blackened with soot. "Out, now," he commanded, scooping up the struggling calf and pushing her ahead of him. They emerged into the cool night air just as the roof collapsed behind them, sending a shower of embers skyward. Mary dropped the bucket she'd been carrying and ran to them, tears cutting clean tracks down her dust-streaked face. "You could have died," she sobbed, clutching Sarah to her chest. "Both of you." As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, the three surveyed what remained. The barn was gone, along with the winter hay and some tools. But thanks to Sarah's quick thinking, not a single animal had been lost. Mary found herself weeping again, not from fear this time, but from a profound gratitude that shattered the careful walls she'd built around her heart. When John placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, she didn't pull away. "We'll rebuild," he said simply. The rancher's eyes met hers. And something passed between them, an understanding deeper than words. The fire had destroyed their shelter, but it had forged something far more valuable in its place: trust. Whispers slithered through red rock like rattlesnakes, growing bolder with each passing day. The sisters' presence at John Smith's ranch had become the town's favorite subject, spawning tales that painted the rancher as everything from a saint to a scoundrel. "Heard he's keeping those Johnson girls like servants," muttered a miner, nursing his whiskey at the saloon counter. Mary ignored the stares when they came to town for supplies, but Sarah's cheeks burned with each sideways glance. Neither sister realized these rumors had reached Robert Brown, whose ambitions stretched far beyond his own property lines. The confrontation came on a sweltering afternoon. John had just finished loading supplies into their wagon when Brown approached, flanked by two hired hands. "Smith," Robert called out, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "Time we settled things properly." The rancher turned slowly, recognizing the challenge in his rival's stance. "Nothing to settle, Brown. Those sisters deserve better than your charity," Robert sneered, hand hovering near his holster. "And your land would serve the territory better under proper management." Mary and Sarah emerged from the general store just as townsfolk began gathering, sensing the familiar electricity of impending violence. The younger sister clutched Mary's arm, eyes wide with fear. "This isn't your fight," John told the women quietly as they approached. Mary's jaw tightened. "It became ours the moment we stepped onto you." The rival rancher staggered backward, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the dirt before he could. The Arizona territory rarely saw snow, but the winter of 1872 brought a bitter cold that cut through the walls of John Smith's ranch house like a knife. Icy winds howled across the plains, transforming the familiar landscape into a hostile wilderness that kept them isolated for weeks. John stood at the window, watching frost patterns form on the glass. "Haven't seen a winter this harsh since '68, he muttered, his breath visible in the chilled air. The rancher's supplies, meant to last until spring, dwindled fast. The stress of confinement showed in the dark circles under her eyes and the sharpness of her tone when Sarah accidentally spilled precious coffee grounds. "I'm sorry," her younger sister whispered, tears threatening. "I was just trying to help." The cramped quarters magnified every frustration. Small irritations grew into heated words, followed by strange silences that stretched for hours. Yet as the blizzard raged outside, something unexpected happened in the quiet moments between arguments. One night, as they huddled near the fireplace, with only a lantern's glow illuminating their faces, John broke his customary silence. "Never thought I'd fear being alone until I wasn't anymore," he confessed, eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "Spent years convincing myself I preferred it that way." Mary looked up from her mending, surprised by his vulnerability. "I understand fear," she admitted, setting aside her needle. "Every time we've lost something, our farm, our parents, I've been terrified of what else might be taken." Her voice trembled slightly. Of who else might leave? Sarah, who had been quietly sketching in the corner, joined them by the fire. "Sometimes I dream of seeing places beyond Red Rock," she whispered. "But then I feel guilty for wanting more when we found safety here." Her confession hung in the air between them. "I'm torn between wanting freedom and being afraid to lose this, whatever this is becoming." The isolation stripped away their careful defenses, revealing raw truths they might never have shared otherwise. John's loneliness, Mary's fear of abandonment, Sarah's conflicted desires, all laid bare in the flickering light. When the rancher reached across the space between them to squeeze Mary's hand, neither pulled away. Sarah watched them with a small smile, understanding that something fundamental had shifted between them all. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault, but within those walls, something stronger than the winter's fury was taking root. The morning dawned with a chill that seeped through the cracks of the ranch house. John Smith was pouring coffee when hoofbeats announced an unexpected visitor. A man in a crisp suit dismounted, introducing himself as a railroad surveyor from the Eastern Pacific Company. "I need to discuss some matters with you, Mr. Smith," he said, pulling rolled parchments from his saddlebag. John's kitchen table, scarred from years of use, now bore the weight of maps that would determine his future. The surveyor's finger traced a bold line cutting directly through the heart of the ranch. "The railway needs this land," he explained, not unkindly. "We're prepared to offer compensation, of course." Mary Johnson stood in the doorway, her face paling as she understood what this meant. Everything they'd fought for, the cattle, the repaired barn, the fragile sense of home, threatened by progress that cared nothing for their struggles. "How long do we have?" John asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. 6 months, perhaps 8. The surveyor rolled up his maps. "I'll return next month with paperwork." After he departed, silence hung heavy between them. Sarah brought tea, her usual chatter subdued by the gravity of the situation. "We'll find a way," Mary said finally, though uncertainty shadowed her eyes. That afternoon, Mary ventured into Red Rock for supplies. At the general store, Thomas Davis, the town's wealthiest merchant, approached her with his customary politeness. The man's tailored clothes and manicured hands spoke of a life untouched by the hardships she knew too well. "Miss Johnson," he greeted her warmly, "I heard about the railroad's plans. Terrible business." His concern seemed genuine, and when he invited her to dinner at the town's only proper restaurant, Mary found herself accepting. Over a meal finer than any she'd had in years, Thomas spoke of his business ventures, his home in town, and his desire for companionship. "A woman of your character deserves security," he said, reaching for her hand. "I could provide that, for you and your sister." The offer lingered between them, tempting and terrifying. Back at the ranch that night, Mary stood on the porch, watching John repair a saddle by lantern light. His weathered face, focused on his work, had become dear to her in ways she hadn't expected. Thomas's proposal gnawed at her thoughts, a life without struggle, without the constant fear of loss. Yet it felt like betrayal, not just of John, but of something within herself she couldn't name. Sarah joined her, leaning against the railing. "What are you thinking about?" Mary sighed. "The price of safety," she answered, "and whether I can afford to pay it." The cattle drive had begun at dawn, with John leading the way across the dusty plains. Mary Johnson rode at his side, her face set with determination as they guided the herd toward better grazing land. Sarah had begged to join them, and after much persuasion, her sister had reluctantly agreed. By midday, when they stopped to water the cattle at a shallow creek, Mary noticed her sister was missing. "Sarah?" she called, panic rising in her throat. She scanned the horizon, seeing nothing but swaying grass and scattered livestock. John's face darkened with concern. "When did you last see her?" "An hour ago, maybe less." Mary's voice cracked. "She was right behind me." They split up immediately, abandoning the drive. John took the northern hills, while Mary searched the eastern ravines, both calling Sarah's name until their voices grew hoarse. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as fear clawed at their hearts. "She's just a girl," Mary whispered to herself as she urged her horse forward. "She doesn't know these lands like we do." Every terrible possibility flashed through her mind: a fall from her horse, an encounter with wild animals, or worse, bandits who sometimes roam these territories. John rode with grim determination, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape. He'd grown fond of the younger Johnson sister, her laughter bringing light to his solitary existence. The thought of harm coming to her made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar ache. As dusk approached, Mary's composure finally shattered. She slid from her saddle beside a rocky outcropping and pressed her palms against her eyes. "I should never have brought her here," she sobbed. "This life is too harsh." It was then they heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Both turned to see Sarah riding toward them, her clothes caked with mud, hair wild around her flushed face. "Where have you been?" Mary rushed to her sister, relief and anger battling in her voice. Sarah dismounted, her eyes downcast but defiant. "I wanted to prove I could track the strays on my own," she admitted. "I followed that spotted calf into the western canyon, but then I got turned around." John approached slowly, his relief evident, though his words were few. "You could have died out there." "I know," Sarah whispered, "but I'm not a child anymore. I need to be useful, to be strong like both of you." That night, back at the ranch, the three sat closer than usual around the fire. Sarah's recklessness had terrified them, yet her confession, her need to prove herself, revealed something important. They were becoming a family, bound by more than circumstance, yet each harboring different dreams and fears. Mary watched John's gentle handling of Sarah's scratched hands and realized their fragile balance could easily shatter. They were three broken people trying to form something whole, and the cracks were beginning to show. The whispers in Red Rock grew louder with each passing day. Robert Brown no longer bothered to hide his intentions, strutting through town with a confidence that made even the most hardened cowboys step aside. The rival rancher had gathered a small army of hired hands, men with cold eyes and quick trigger fingers who seemed to materialize from the dust itself. John Smith discovered the damage at dawn. 3 sections of fence cut clean through, allowing nearly 24 head of cattle to wander into the wilderness. It was the 3rd such incident in 2 weeks. "This ends now," John muttered, his weathered face tight with anger, as Mary Johnson joined him at the broken fence line. "We can't prove it was him," she said, though they both knew the truth. The rancher knelt to examine the clean cuts in the wire. Brown's men don't even try to hide their tracks anymore. That evening, a local cowhand rode breathlessly into the yard, hat in hand. "Smith, they've taken your prize bull and 4 heifers." Saw them being driven toward Brown's northern pasture. Mary watched John's hands clench into fists, the veins standing out like rivers on a map. She placed her palm against his arm, feeling the tension beneath his skin. "We'll get them back," she promised. In town the next day, Mary felt eyes following her as she collected supplies at the general store. The shopkeeper leaned across the counter, voice low. "You folks should be careful out there. Brown's been drinking at the saloon, boasting that Smith's land will be his by winter." Mary's spine stiffened. John's not alone anymore. That's what worries folks. The man replied, "Brown doesn't like losing, and he sees you and your sister as complications." That night, Mary found John cleaning his firearm by lamplight, his movements methodical, almost meditative. Without speaking, she sat beside him, their shoulders touching. "I should never have brought this trouble to you and Sarah," he said finally. "We brought our own troubles," Mary answered, "and found something worth fighting for." The confession hung between them, neither quite ready to name what had grown in the space of shared labor and danger. Each moment of peril had stripped away another layer of pretense, revealing something neither had expected to find in the harsh Arizona territory. "Brown came to see me today," John admitted. "Offered to buy the ranch." Mary's breath caught. "And?" "I told him this land isn't just mine anymore." Their eyes met in the flickering light, and Mary understood that they were speaking about more than just acres and cattle. Something had been claimed here, something neither Robert Brown nor any other force could take without a fight. "Then we stand together," she said simply, her hand finding his in the darkness. The crackling fire cast long shadows across the cabin walls as John Smith stared into the amber flames. Outside, the Arizona wind howled, a lonely sound that matched the turmoil in his heart. Mary sat across from him, her fingers methodically mending a torn shirt, while Sarah had long since retired to her small room. "There's something I need to tell you," John finally said, his voice barely audible above the fire's snap. He placed his coffee mug down with deliberate care. "About this land." Mary looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. The rancher's face was etched with lines she hadn't noticed before, illuminated by the firelight's unforgiving glow. "5 years ago, this territory saw the worst drought in memory," he continued. "Cattle dropped dead in the fields, crops withered, families packed whatever they could carry and just left." His calloused hands trembled slightly. "The Millers owned this place before me. Good people. 4 children." Mary set her mending aside, listening intently. "They held on longer than most, but when their youngest took fever," John's voice cracked. "I was working for them then. Mr. Miller sold me this ranch for almost nothing before they headed to California. Said someone should keep it alive." The wind rattled the windows as John confessed how he'd acquired his home through others' misfortune. "Sometimes I wake thinking I hear their children laughing. I wonder if I took advantage, if I'm any better than those railroad men or Robert Brown." Mary studied his face, seeing past the stoic mask he wore in daylight. This wasn't the confession of an opportunist, but of a man haunted by circumstance. "We all survive how we can," she said softly, rising from her chair. "After our parents died, I did things I'm not proud of to keep Sarah fed." She moved beside him, her hand finding his. "I lied, stole medicine when she was sick. Once, I nearly—" She swallowed hard. "Well, some choices haunt us." John turned to her, surprise evident in his eyes. The touch of her hand on his was warm, steady. "You gave the Millers hope when they had none," Mary continued. "You've kept their dream alive. This land thrives because of your hands." Outside, the wind began to settle, as if listening. "And you," John said, his voice finding strength, "you protected what mattered most." Mary nodded, understanding flowing between them like an invisible current. For the first time, she saw John not as the lonely rancher or her reluctant savior, but as someone who carried burdens as heavy as her own. In that moment of shared vulnerability, something shifted between them, a foundation stronger than the weathered beams of the ranch house itself. The weight of frontier life bore down on Mary Johnson as she watched Sarah struggle with another day of back-breaking labor. The younger girl's hands were blistered and raw, her once bright eyes dimmed by exhaustion. Though Sarah never complained, Mary caught her sister staring longingly toward the distant mountains, the same restless gaze their father had worn before abandonment claimed him. That night, after Sarah had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Mary sat alone on the porch steps. The Arizona territory stretched endlessly before her, beautiful and merciless. She'd promised their dying mother to keep Sarah safe, and now that promise was slipping through her fingers like the red dust that covered everything. John Smith found her there, offering a steaming cup of coffee without a word. The rancher's face was weathered by sun and hardship, but his eyes held a kindness that had slowly earned her trust over these difficult months. "I have a proposition," Mary said finally, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I'll marry you, John." The rancher nearly dropped his cup. "What?" "It makes sense," she continued, practical as always. "You need help with this land. I need security for Sarah. We work well together." John studied her face in the moonlight. "Marriage isn't a business arrangement, Mary. Isn't it?" She laughed without humor. "For women out here, it's the only currency we have." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and cattle. John set his cup down carefully, choosing his words with the same deliberation he showed when mending fences or tracking strays. "And what about love?" he asked quietly. Mary looked away. "I respect you. I trust you. That's more than most marriages start with." The rancher stood and paced the length of the porch. He'd lived alone so long that the thought of binding himself to another person felt both terrifying and achingly desirable. Mary wasn't offering her heart, not fully, but she was offering companionship, partnership, and the family he'd secretly yearned for. "And Sarah?" he asked. "She needs stability, education, a future beyond just surviving." Mary's voice broke slightly. "I can't give her that alone." John thought of Sarah's laughter when he taught her to lasso, how it had filled empty corners of his home he hadn't realized were vacant. He thought of Mary's fierce intelligence, her unwavering loyalty. "I won't trap you," he said finally. "Either of you." Mary stood, facing him directly. Sometimes what looks like a trap is actually shelter. She extended her hand, a gesture more binding than any embrace. "Do we have an agreement?" John looked at her outstretched hand, understanding that this moment would forever divide his life into before and after. Was this captivity or belonging? Resignation or hope? The answer, he realized, might take a lifetime to discover. The snows melted along the fence lines, revealing green shoots that promised renewal. John Smith stood on his porch, watching as riders approached his property with news that changed everything. The railroad company had altered their plans. The tracks would now skirt the eastern edge of Red Rock, leaving his ranch untouched by their iron path. "Your land is safe," the company representative explained, tipping his hat before riding away. "The new route makes better business sense." Relief washed over John, but it was tempered by uncertainty. The reprieve meant his world would remain intact, yet everything around it would transform. Already, Red Rock buzzed with new energy, surveyors, laborers, and opportunists flooding the once quiet town. Saloons stayed open later, the general store expanded its inventory, and talk of a proper hotel filled the air. Mary Johnson watched these changes with cautious eyes. "The town's growing faster than spring weeds," she observed one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner. Her hands, rough from ranch work, rested in her lap. "Sarah can't stop talking about all the new faces." John nodded, studying Mary's profile in the fading light. The hard winter had softened something between them, not just in how they spoke, but in the comfortable silences they now shared. "She's young," he replied. "New things catch young eyes." The truth hung unspoken between them. With the railroad's arrival, opportunities would multiply. The sisters could find easier work in town, perhaps even passage elsewhere. The bonds forged through shared hardship might not be enough to keep them when other paths opened. That night, unable to sleep, John walked to the barn. The structure, rebuilt after the fire, stood as testament to their collective resilience. Inside, he ran his hand along a beam that Sarah had helped raise, remembering her determined face as she'd pushed it upright. The next morning, Sarah burst into the kitchen, eyes bright with excitement. "There's talk of a school coming," she announced, setting down a basket of eggs. "And a proper dressmaker's shop." Mary glanced at John, their eyes meeting in silent communication. They both recognized the crossroads before them. "This ranch," John said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "has room enough for dreams of all kinds." It wasn't quite an invitation to stay, nor permission to leave. Instead, it acknowledged the choice that lay before them, to remain together in this hard-won peace, or to seek separate futures. That evening, as the three sat watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, their shoulders touched in a line of quiet solidarity. Whatever tomorrow brought, they faced it not as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but as a family forged by choice. The letter arrived with the supply wagon, its envelope worn from the journey. Mary Johnson unfolded the crisp paper with steady hands, her eyes scanning Thomas Davis's flowing script. The wealthy merchant was departing Red Rock permanently, his business interests drawing him eastward to St. Louis. His marriage proposal, once dangled before her like salvation, was formally withdrawn. Mary stood on the porch, watching the horizon where dust devils danced across the plains. She expected to feel loss, perhaps even panic, at this vanished opportunity for security. Instead, a strange lightness filled her chest. The promise of fine dresses and a comfortable home had never truly called to her heart. "Bad news?" John asked, his voice low as he approached, wiping his hands on a rag after fixing a broken saddle. "Thomas is leaving," she replied simply. "His proposal is no longer an option." John nodded, his weathered face revealing nothing, though his shoulders seemed to relax imperceptibly. "You don't seem troubled by it." Mary smiled, surprising herself. "I'm not. I thought I wanted safety, but I found something better here." Her fingers brushed against the wooden railing, feeling the grain beneath her skin. "I found purpose." Inside the ranch house, Sarah hummed as she prepared the evening meal. The younger Johnson sister had been uncharacteristically settled these past weeks, her previous restlessness giving way to a focused energy. That morning, she had announced her intention to help expand the vegetable garden, planning for seasons ahead. Later that evening, as they sat around the table, Sarah looked up from her plate. "I saw a poster in town about a traveling show coming through next month," she said. "I thought we might all go together." Mary studied her sister's face, remembering the girl who once spoke only of leaving, of grand adventures beyond the horizon. Now Sarah spoke of we and together, with an ease that revealed her changing heart. "I'd like that," John replied, his usual reserve softening in the lamplight. Outside, the wind whispered across the plains, carrying the scent of spring. The railroad would bring change to Red Rock, but within these walls, something precious had already transformed. Mary realized that true safety wasn't found in a merchant's proposal or a fine house in town. It lived in the trust they'd built, in the shared work of their hands, in choosing to stay when the world offered reasons to leave. That night, as Mary prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the small mirror. The woman who stared back was no longer running from loss or clinging to fear. She had chosen this place, these people, this life, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because nowhere else was home. The ranch flourished as spring warmed the land. The harsh winter had retreated, leaving behind new grass that pushed through the red soil with stubborn determination. John Smith stood on his porch at dawn, surveying the cattle grazing peacefully, where once there had been only barren earth and uncertainty. His body carried the marks of his struggles, a scar along his forearm from the barn fire, calloused hands from rebuilding fences. But these were badges of survival rather than wounds. Inside the ranch house, Mary Johnson moved with quiet efficiency. Her sharp eyes softened now by something that resembled contentment. She'd learned to read the land as well as she read John, understanding the subtle shifts in weather and mood that governed their lives. The protective wall she had built around herself and Sarah had transformed into something different, not a barrier, but a foundation upon which they were building something new. "The south pasture looks good this year," John remarked as Mary joined him outside, her hair catching the morning light. She nodded, allowing herself to lean slightly against his shoulder. "Better than we could have hoped after what Robert Brown tried to do." The rival rancher had eventually retreated, his ambitions thwarted by their united stand. The railroad's decision to alter its route had diminished his leverage, leaving John's land intact and their future secure. What had once seemed like devastating loss, the sisters' family farm, John's isolation, had somehow led them here, to this unexpected peace. Sarah emerged from the barn, leading a dappled mare she had trained herself. At 19, she had blossomed in the Arizona territory, her adventurous spirit finding purpose in the daily challenges of ranch life. She waved excitedly, pointing to how the horse responded to her gentle commands. "She's got away with them," John said, pride evident in his voice. "Never seen anyone gentle a horse so quick." Mary smiled, remembering her initial fears that the frontier would crush her sister's spirit. Instead, Sarah had found freedom within its vastness, her innocence not lost, but transformed into a resilient joy. That evening, as dust painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, the three sat together on the porch. The wind that had once seemed so hostile now carried the scent of wildflowers and promise. John reached for Mary's hand, his gesture no longer hesitant, but assured. "We made it," she whispered, her voice steady with the strength that had carried them through. The rancher nodded, his heart full with the family he'd found in these two women who had stepped off a stagecoach and into his lonely existence. Together, they faced every dawn with new courage. The dust and wind of Arizona no longer a threat, but a reminder of all they had overcome. The railroad cut through the landscape like a steel serpent, bringing change to Red Rock with each passing week. New faces appeared in town, and the once sleepy saloon now bustled with activity day and night. Yet amid this transformation, John Smith's ranch remained a sanctuary of constancy, its borders defined not by railroad tracks, but by the hearts that dwelled within. From the porch of the ranch house, John watched the distant plumes of steam rising from locomotives. He no longer viewed them as harbingers of doom, but merely as another element of the ever-changing West. The rancher's calloused hands rested on the wooden railing, bearing the marks of countless battles against nature and men alike. "Thinking about town again?" Mary's voice came softly as she joined him, her shoulder brushing against his. The woman who had once bargained fiercely for shelter now stood beside him as his equal. Her sharp edges softened, but her strength undiminished. "Just thinking how different things might have been," he replied, turning to face her. The afternoon sun caught in her hair, reminding him of that first day when a battered stagecoach had delivered unexpected salvation to his lonely existence. Inside, Sarah's laughter rang out as she prepared the evening meal. The youngest Johnson sister had blossomed on the ranch, her adventurous spirit finding purpose in the daily rhythms of frontier life. She'd grown from a wide-eyed girl into a capable young woman, still dreaming, but now rooted in something real. "Robert Brown rode past the north pasture yesterday," John said quietly. "Just watching. No trouble." Mary nodded. "He knows better now." Their shared victories had taught even the most ambitious rival that this land was defended not just by one man's determination, but by a family's united will. As dusk settled over the plains, the three gathered around the kitchen table, a simple ritual that had come to define their days. The flickering lamplight illuminated their faces as they shared bread and stories, plans and hopes. No longer were they bound by mere necessity or circumstance. They had chosen each other, again and again, through drought and plenty. John looked at the sisters, at his family, and felt the weight of solitude lift from his shoulders. The rancher, who once feared attachment, now understood that true freedom came not from standing alone, but from building something worth protecting. The land had given him purpose, but these two women had given him home. Outside, the Arizona wind whistled its familiar tune across the plains, but its lonely howl no longer echoed in John's heart. Within these walls, three souls had forged bonds stronger than blood, creating a legacy that would outlast even the most determined railroad. In this wild corner of the West, they had discovered that family wasn't what you were born into. It was what you built together, day by day, choice by choice, through the harshest storms and the gentlest dawns.